A protective order, a school parking lot, a father-in-law's phone call, a couch hauled to a landfill, a Valentine's Day that ended in a county investigation lasting 7 years, a cell phone that placed a man somewhere he said he had never been. In the state of Maryland, across 8 counties, across 4 decades, the person closest to the victim turned out to be the person a court would hold responsible. 8 marriages, 8 verdicts, documented, verified, public record. You are watching Truth 2 Bear Crime Stories. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. Truth 2 Bear Crime Stories covers real court-verified criminal cases built on evidence, investigation, and legal process. We do not speculate. We do not sensationalize. Everything you hear on this channel comes from public court records, appellate opinions, trial testimony, and official prosecutor statements. Today we will cover 8 real Maryland cases in which a husband was convicted in connection with the death of his wife. These cases span the years 1979 through 2020. They cross 8 Maryland counties. They involve forensic science, cell phone tracking, cadaver dogs, blood typing, ballistics, immunity agreements, and no-body prosecutions. Some took years to solve. Some went through multiple trials. Every single one ended in a conviction. Grab a seat. Pay attention. This is going to move fast. Case 1. The protective order was supposed to protect her. It was dated March of 2016. It had been granted by a court. It named the firearms. It listed a decade of alleged abuse. It placed Eulalio Sevilla Tordal on administrative leave from his federal security position. And yet, 6 weeks later, Gladys Tordal drove to a school parking lot to pick up her daughters and was killed. That is where this case begins. Not with a mystery, not with a missing person. With a protective order that existed on paper, a man who surrendered most of his weapons and kept one, and a sequence of events that unfolded across 2 Maryland counties over the span of 24 hours. Events that would result in the deaths of 3 people, injuries to others, and 2 separate criminal prosecutions. Eulalio Sevilla Tordal was born on June the 30th, 1953. He was a federal officer with the United States Federal Protective Service, on the agency responsible for securing government buildings across the Washington metropolitan region. He had worked security assignments at the National Institutes of Health and other federal facilities. He was, by professional designation, a trained law enforcement officer. His wife, Gladys Tordal, was a chemistry teacher at Parkdale High School in Riverdale in Prince George's County. The household included Gladys's 2 daughters from a prior relationship. By the early months of 2016, the marriage had deteriorated significantly. In March of 2016, Gladys went to court. She obtained a civil protective order. That order stated that she had been subjected to approximately 10 years of abuse. It also detailed the number and types of firearms that Tordal possessed as a result of his law enforcement career and background. Under the terms of the order and the legal obligations that followed, Tordal surrendered a significant number of those weapons. As Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy would later describe during sentencing proceedings, Tordal handed over a cache of firearms in compliance with the order. He did not surrender all of them. He retained one. As a direct consequence of the protective order, Tordal's agency placed him on administrative leave. He was no longer reporting to his federal position. He was, as of that spring, a man with a protective order against him, a suspended career, and a household from which he had been effectively removed. On May the 5th, 2016, Gladys Tordal drove to High Point High School in Beltsville, Prince George's County. She was there to pick up her daughters after school. Eulalio Tordal was also there. He had followed her. A bystander, a man named John Lancaster, observed a confrontation and approached. He asked whether everything was all right. Tortle identified himself as the woman's husband. In the school parking lot, Gladys Tortle was killed. John Lancaster was injured. Gladys was 44 years old. One of her daughters, who was inside the school building, called 911 and identified her stepfather by name as the person responsible. Prince George's County Police issued an alert. They released a description of Tortle's vehicle and his physical description. Officers began canvassing the area, and the investigation became significantly more complex the following morning. On May the 6th, 2016, a series of additional shootings occurred in Montgomery County, the jurisdiction directly to the northwest. 2 people died in those incidents. Malcolm Mike Winful, 45 years old, of Boyds, Maryland, and Claudina Molina, 65 years old, a retired woman from the Silver Spring area. Additional individuals were injured. These shootings occurred in 2 separate parking lot locations in Montgomery County. Detectives from both Prince George's County and Montgomery County worked rapidly to determine whether these new incidents were connected to the event the previous afternoon. The investigative method used to link the scenes was ballistics analysis. A detective submitted the fired rounds recovered from each scene for comparison. The analysis established that the same firearm had been used across the locations. That conclusion tied the scenes together and confirmed they were looking at one individual responsible for all of them. Witness accounts from Montgomery County also identified Tortle's vehicle in proximity to the shooting locations. A second factor that contributed to Tortle's capture was documented in the investigation report. During one of the Montgomery County incidents, a physical struggle occurred. During that struggle, Tortle lost his corrective eyeglasses. Without them, his ability to drive was significantly compromised. Investigators noted in the record that the loss of his glasses was a material factor in limiting his movement and preventing him from leaving the area. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon on May the 6th, less than 24 hours after the death of Gladys Tortle, Eulalio Tortle was taken into custody in the Aspen Hill area of Montgomery County. He was transported and held pending charges in both jurisdictions. 2 separate prosecutions followed, handled independently by the state's attorneys for Prince George's County and Montgomery County, respectively. The cases proceeded on parallel tracks through 2016 and into 2017. In Montgomery County, Tortle pleaded guilty in April of 2017 to 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Malcolm Winful and Claudina Molina, and to 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the individuals who were injured. In July of 2017, a Montgomery County judge sentenced Eulalio Tortle to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 3 consecutive additional life terms. The court imposed those sentences consecutively, meaning they run one after another and are not combined. In Prince George's County, Tortle pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of his wife, Gladys Tortle, and to the assault of John Lancaster, the bystander who had been injured in the school parking lot. The Prince George's County sentencing hearing took place in September of 2017. The presiding judge sentenced Tortle to 2 life terms, one for the murder of Gladys Tortle and one for the harm to Lancaster. At that hearing, the judge addressed the defendant directly and stated, "There should be no mercy in the situation for a number of reasons. How do I count the ways?" That statement was entered into the public record of the proceeding. The Tortle prosecution is cited regularly in Maryland discussions of 2 distinct legal and policy issues. The first is the enforcement of civil protective orders when the subject of the order is a trained law enforcement officer with access to firearms beyond what civilian subjects typically possess. The second is the question of whether administrative leave, the mechanism used to temporarily remove Tortle from his federal position, is a sufficient institutional response when an officer is subject to a domestic protective order. As of the most recent available public records, Eulalio Sevilla Tordal is incarcerated at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, where he is serving the entirety of his combined sentences with no possibility of parole. Gladys Tordal's daughters were present at the scene the day their mother was killed and were present at multiple points throughout the prosecution. The protective order their mother obtained existed because the legal system provided that mechanism. What the Tordal case documents for the court record and for history is the gap between what a protective order requires and what a determined individual with weapons training chooses to do. That is, Case 1, Eulalio Tordal, Prince George's County, pleaded guilty, 2 life sentences in this jurisdiction, life without parole plus 3 consecutive life terms in the jurisdiction next door. Every word of that is in the public record. Like this video, if you are finding it valuable, leave a comment. Subscribe to Truth to Bear. Case 2 is coming right now. Case 2. She was never found, not in 1996 when her husband called to report her missing, not in 1997, not in 1998, 99, or 2000, not at any point during the 4-year investigation that followed. Nancy Riggins was never located. Her remains were never recovered. And yet in July of 2001, a Howard County jury convicted her husband, Paul Stephen Riggins Jr., of her first-degree murder. This is a nobody prosecution. It is one of the most legally significant cases in Maryland's appellate history, and it stands today as a foundational example of how a homicide conviction can be secured through circumstantial evidence alone, without physical remains, without a crime scene confirmed by the presence of a body, and without a direct witness to the act. Paul Stephen Riggins Jr. lived in Howard County, Maryland with his wife Nancy. The marriage had been in place for a significant number of years. Court records document that at some point during the marriage, Riggins entered into a relationship with a younger woman named Amy Cole. Amy Cole had worked as a babysitter for the Riggins household and had cared for the couple's daughter. The relationship between Riggins and Cole continued and deepened as the marriage between Riggins and Nancy deteriorated. On July 3, 1996, the day before Independence Day, Paul Riggins called 911. He reported that his wife Nancy was missing. He told authorities he did not know where she had gone. He stated she had not come home. The Howard County Police Department opened a missing persons investigation immediately. Officers and detectives began conducting the standard checks that a missing person investigation requires. They ran her name, her date of birth, and her social security number through law enforcement databases. They checked motor vehicle records not only in Maryland but across the country, looking for any indication that Nancy Riggins had obtained a driver's license, registered a vehicle, or been stopped or cited by law enforcement in another state. They monitored her financial accounts for any activity, withdrawals, purchases, transactions of any kind. They tracked her credit history. They contacted hospitals and treatment facilities. None of those checks produced a result. Nancy Riggins did not appear in motor vehicle records. She did not use her bank accounts or credit accounts after the date of her disappearance. She did not surface in any law enforcement database in any state. She did not contact family members or friends. Every method available to investigators to locate a living person returned the same result: nothing. That pattern of absence, the complete and sustained disappearance of all financial activity, all contact, all records, was itself a form of evidence. It told investigators that this was not a woman who had chosen to leave. A person who chooses to leave, even under difficult circumstances, leaves traces. She might rent an apartment, use a credit card, apply for employment, renew a driver's license. Nancy Riggins left none of those traces. On the conclusion investigators developed over the course of 4 years was that Nancy Riggins was not living and had not been living since July of 1996. The Howard County Police Department continued the investigation through 1997, 1998, 99, and into 2000. Investigators gathered circumstantial evidence during that time. They documented statements that Riggins had made to other individuals, statements that were inconsistent with the account of a concerned spouse who did not know what had happened to his wife. They documented evidence of conduct that tended to impede the investigation or steer attention away from Riggins himself. They built a timeline of the marriage and the relationship with Amy Cole. They spoke with people who knew the family, who had observed the marriage, and who could speak to the state of the relationship in the weeks and months before Nancy vanished. On September the 21st, 2000, 4 years and nearly 3 months after the 911 call, Paul Stephen Riggins Jr. was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Nancy Riggins. The case went to trial in the Circuit Court for Howard County. The prosecution's case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no body. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no forensic evidence of a killing, no blood, no weapon, no physical trace of violence. What the state presented was a framework built on the sustained disappearance of a living person, the financial and behavioral evidence that ruled out voluntary departure, the statements Riggins had made to others, his conduct during the investigation, the existence of a motive in the form of his relationship with Amy Cole, and the logical inference available to a jury that a person cannot simply vanish without cause. On July the 20th, 2001, after hearing all of that evidence, the jury in Howard County returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Paul Stephen Riggins Jr. was convicted of killing his wife, despite the fact that no one had ever found her remains. On November the 29th, 2001, the Circuit Court for Howard County sentenced Riggins to life imprisonment. Riggins appealed the conviction. His primary argument on appeal was a legal one. He contended that, as a matter of law, the evidence was not sufficient to support a murder conviction when no body had ever been recovered and no physical evidence of a killing had been produced at trial. He further argued that the jury should have received an instruction on what lawyers call the corpus delicti rule, the principle that before a confession or other evidence of guilt can be used to convict, the prosecution must independently establish that a crime actually occurred. Riggins argued that without a body, the state could not establish the corpus delicti, the basic fact that a crime had taken place. The Maryland Court of Special Appeals disagreed. The court's opinion, reported at 155, Maryland Appellate 281, and decided in 2004, addressed each of Riggins's arguments in detail. Writing for the court, Judge James A. Kenney III stated the following, which is now reproduced in Maryland legal materials as a foundational proposition. Clearly, a murder conviction is not dependent upon the recovery of the victim's body. The court held that the evidence presented at trial, the sustained disappearance, the absence of any financial activity, the breakdown of all contact, the pattern of conduct by Riggins, and the circumstantial evidence of motive was sufficient to establish both that Nancy Riggins was dead and that her death was not the result of accident, suicide, or natural causes. The conviction was affirmed in full. The Riggins versus state opinion is taught in Maryland law schools and cited in briefs and judicial opinions to this day. It is the clearest statement in Maryland appellate law that a jury may convict a defendant of murder even when the victim's body has never been found, provided the prosecution presents independent evidence that the death resulted from criminal agency. The case permanently answered the question of whether Maryland courts would permit no-body murder convictions. The answer, after July the 20th, 2001, and confirmed on appeal in 2004, is yes. Paul Stephen Riggins Jr. is serving a life sentence in the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. Nancy Riggins has never been found. She remains listed in the public record as a victim of homicide. Case 3. She slept on the couch in the basement during the summer months. That detail, which came out through witness testimony at trial, turned out to be one of the most significant facts in the entire investigation. Because prosecutors would argue that the couch itself became the means by which evidence was concealed, hauled out of the house and sent to a county landfill, where it was compacted with tons of refuse and could not be recovered. Lisa, too, disappeared on the night of July the 12th into July the 13th, 1988. She was never found. Her husband, Gregory Mungsen, too, was convicted of her murder twice. Gregory Mungsen II and Lisa II, also identified in court records as Lisa Lau II, had been together for approximately 10 years. They lived in Montgomery County, Maryland. The state described a relationship that had experienced significant difficulties and presented evidence of what it characterized as both a personal and a financial motive for the defendant's conduct. The specific nature of those motives was established through the testimony of individuals who knew the couple, through documentary evidence including financial records, and through the pattern of behavior documented in the investigation. Lisa, too, was last seen or in contact with anyone on the night of July the 12th, 1988. The following morning, July the 13th, she was simply gone. Friends and relatives who had known Lisa and maintained regular contact with her testified at trial that all communication from her stopped at that point, with no warning and no prior indication that she intended to leave or disappear. Just as significantly, activity on her bank accounts and credit cards stopped at the same time. There were no withdrawals, no purchases, no transactions of any kind after July the 12th to 13th, 1988. The account sat dormant from that night forward. Investigators in Montgomery County opened an investigation. The central forensic challenge was that there was no confirmed crime scene, no recovered body, and no direct physical evidence of a killing, at least not initially. What investigators did find when they examined the home was blood. Forensic analysts collected blood evidence from the basement of the home and from the covering of the couch on which Lisa normally slept during the summer months. That blood was analyzed using the forensic methods available in the late 1980s, and the analysts testified at trial that the blood matched Lisa too with a high degree of probability. The couch was gone by the time investigators examined the residence. The state developed the theory, supported by evidence presented at trial, that the couch had been removed from the home and taken to a Montgomery County landfill. Once at the landfill, the state contended it had been processed along with the facility's regular load of municipal solid waste. Landfill compaction equipment operates with significant force, and material processed in that way becomes effectively impossible to separate or recover. Investigators attempted to locate the couch through the landfill but were unable to do so. The couch and any evidence it might have contained was gone. In addition to the blood evidence, investigators documented two additional significant facts. First, a pistol that Tu was known to own disappeared at approximately the same time as his wife. The weapon was never recovered. Second, investigators developed information that Tu had traveled to Las Vegas, Nevada after his wife's disappearance. In his motel room there, investigators seized a briefcase that contained incriminating materials. Tu was tried and convicted of first-degree murder in November of 1989 and sentenced to life imprisonment. That conviction was subsequently reversed by the Maryland Court of Special Appeals. The basis for the reversal was the briefcase. The court found that law enforcement had obtained the briefcase through a seizure that did not comply with the legal requirements of the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Because the briefcase and its contents had been obtained unlawfully, The court held that the evidence derived from it could not be used at trial. The conviction was vacated and the case was sent back to the trial court. On remand, a new suppression hearing was conducted. This time, the state presented different legal arguments and different facts regarding the circumstances of the seizure. The trial court ruled at the new hearing that the briefcase was admissible under the applicable legal standards as argued on remand. The case proceeded to a second trial. At the retrial, the jury deliberated and returned its verdict on April the 29th, 1992. The result was different from the first trial in one significant respect. 2 was acquitted of first-degree murder. The jury did not find sufficient evidence for that charge. However, the jury did find sufficient evidence to convict him of second-degree murder, a conviction that requires proof of an intentional killing but does not require proof of premeditation. 2 was sentenced to 30 years in prison on the second-degree murder conviction. The appellate litigation surrounding the 2 case addressed important questions of Maryland evidence and procedure law. Among the issues the courts addressed was the law of the case doctrine, the principle that legal rulings made in an earlier appeal generally bind the court on remand, and the extent to which that doctrine limits what evidence can be reconsidered when a case returns to the trial court. The 2 litigation is cited in Maryland. Evidence materials as an example of how suppression hearings can produce different outcomes when they are conducted on different legal records. The 2 prosecution stands alongside the Riggins case as one of the most significant no-body homicide prosecutions in Maryland history. What distinguishes it from Riggins is the presence of blood evidence, a forensic connection between the victim and the crime scene that Riggins lacked entirely. What connects them is the fundamental principle that a jury can determine, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a person is dead and that their death was caused by another person, even when the victim's remains are never recovered. Gregory Mungsen II served time in the Maryland correction system. Lisa II has never been found. Her bank accounts, as of the public record established at trial, never showed another transaction after the night of July the 12th, 1988. We are now 1/3 of the way through this program. If Truth to Bear is new to you, subscribe right now and leave a comment telling us which case you are following most closely. Case 4 is a murder-for-hire case from Carroll County, and it produced one of the longest jury trials in Maryland history. Case 4, 72 days. That is how long the jury trial lasted. 72 days of testimony, evidence, and cross-examination in a Carroll County courtroom. When it was over, 3 days of jury deliberation produced a verdict that established a legal precedent on immunity agreements, accomplice testimony, and the accessory before the fact doctrine that Maryland courts still reference today. At the center of it was a Westminster businessman, a murder-for-hire arrangement that prosecutors said cost $10,000, and the death of a 43-year-old woman at her own home in Silver Run. Robert Lee Myers, known to people in Westminster as Bobby Myers, ran an accounting firm called Maryland Business Service. He was a prominent figure in Carroll County business circles. His wife, Mary Ruth Myers, worked at the firm with him. The couple was married and had established a professional as well as a personal life together through the accounting practice. Evidence at trial established that at some point during the marriage, Robert Myers entered into a relationship with another woman. That woman, later identified in the trial record under the name Ernestine Marco, referred to throughout the proceedings by her nickname Tina, became a significant witness in the case. She would ultimately receive immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony against her own co-defendants. On August the 29th, 1979, Mary Ruth Myers did not arrive for work at the accounting firm she shared with her husband. That was unusual. Co-workers noted her absence, and when she could not be reached, drove to the Myers residence on Turkeyfoot Road in Silver Run in Carroll County. When they arrived at the home and entered, they found Mary Ruth Myers in the bedroom, She was dead. She was 43 years old. The Maryland State Police opened a homicide investigation. What followed was not a quick case. The investigation lasted more than 18 months. During that time, detectives, including former Maryland State Police Detective Jim Leet, developed evidence that Mary Ruth Myers had not been killed by a stranger and that the killing was not the result of a robbery or a random act. The evidence pointed toward a planned killing in which Robert Myers had allegedly arranged and paid for someone else to carry out the act. The legal term for that kind of criminal liability is accessory before the fact. Under Maryland law, a person who plans, arranges, finances, or otherwise enables a murder to be committed by another person can be convicted of first-degree murder as an accessory before the fact, even though they were not the person who directly performed the act. The state's theory was that Robert Myers had arranged for a man named Daniel Lee Chatterton to kill Mary Ruth Myers in exchange for a payment of $10,000. The Carroll County Grand Jury returned indictments against 3 people: Robert Lee Myers, Daniel Lee Chatterton, and Ernestine Tina Marco. In the proceedings that followed, Marco was granted immunity from prosecution. Immunity agreements are a common and legally recognized tool in prosecutions involving multiple defendants, particularly in cases where the state needs an insider witness to establish the full picture of what occurred. In exchange for her immunity, Marco agreed to cooperate with the investigation and testify against Myers and Chatterton. The trial of Robert Lee Myers began and became a landmark in Carroll County legal history before it even reached the verdict. The proceedings lasted 72 days, a number that courtroom observers and legal historians in that county describe as the longest jury trial in Carroll County history and among the longest in the entire state of Maryland at that time. The length reflected the complexity of the evidence, the number of witnesses called, and the extensive cross-examination conducted by defense counsel on the immunity agreement, the credibility of Marco's testimony, and the legal theory of accessory before the fact liability. The prosecution presented evidence on multiple fronts. It presented documentary evidence of the business relationship and financial arrangements between Myers and his associates. It presented testimony about the relationship between Myers and Marco. It presented evidence about Myers's conduct in the period leading up to and following Mary Ruth's death. And it presented the testimony of Tina Marco herself, who described the arrangements that had been made and identified Myers as the person who had initiated and financed the plan. Defense counsel challenged every element. The most pointed challenge was directed at Marco's testimony. Our defense attorneys argued that an immunized witness, a person who has been promised freedom from prosecution in exchange for testimony, has an inherent incentive to shape their account in a way that satisfies the prosecution. That argument is a standard and legally recognized challenge in cases involving immunity agreements. The jury waited and, after 3 days of deliberation, returned its verdict in December of 1982. Robert Lee Myers was convicted of first-degree murder as an accessory before the fact. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Daniel Lee Chatterton, the man the state alleged had carried out the killing, was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Myers appealed. Among the arguments he raised on appeal was a challenge to the trial court's decision not to give the jury a voluntary intoxication instruction. That instruction, in cases where it applies, asks a jury to consider whether a defendant was so impaired at the time of the alleged offense that they lacked the specific intent required for the crime charged. The Court of Special Appeals addressed this and other arguments and affirmed the conviction in Myers v. State, decided in 1984. The conviction stood in full. Robert Lee Myers remained in custody in the Maryland Correction System for more than 3 decades. In January of 2014, he died in a prison hospital while serving his life sentence. He was never released. Oh, the Myers case remains one of the defining examples in Maryland criminal law of a successful murder-for-hire prosecution built on the testimony of an immunized co-defendant. It raised questions that courts and prosecutors throughout the state have had to address in subsequent cases. How much weight should a jury give to testimony from a witness who has been granted immunity? What corroboration is required? What does the accessory before the fact doctrine require in terms of proof of the defendant's knowledge and intent? The Carroll County jury that deliberated for 3 days in December of 1982 answered those questions with a verdict. The Court of Special Appeals confirmed that the answers were legally sound. Case 5. Valentine's Day, 1986. Frances K. Snyder, 43 years old, walked out of the family home in the Relay area of Baltimore County on her way to her job at Westinghouse. She never got there. Her remains were recovered across the street from the house. Her husband, William L. Snyder Sr., told police he had been at home that morning and had not heard her leave, and that he found her that night. What followed was one of the most procedurally complex spousal homicide cases in Maryland appellate history. Snyder was not arrested for 7 years. He was convicted twice. He had his convictions reversed twice. And the Maryland Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, used his case to establish important limits on a category of evidence called consciousness of guilt evidence. The case is still cited in Maryland courts. William L. Snyder Sr. worked as a used car salesman. He and Frances K. Snyder had been married for a significant number of years and had 5 children together. The state's theory, developed over the course of the investigation, was that Snyder had a motive rooted in the breakdown of the marriage and in financial considerations, specifically that he wished to retain the family home and collect on his wife's life insurance policy. On the morning of February the 14th, 1986, Frances K. Snyder left, or attempted to leave, the family home in the 1800 block of Clark Boulevard in the Relay area of Baltimore County. She was heading to work at Westinghouse. She did not arrive. Her remains were recovered across the street from the house. Snyder told law enforcement that he had been inside the home that morning, and that he had not heard her leave or heard anything unusual, and that he found her body that evening when he came outside. The Baltimore County Police Department opened a homicide investigation. The investigation was challenging from the start because of the absence of direct physical evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the event. There was no forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no blood, no biological material that directly tied Snyder to his wife's death. The state's investigation, therefore, proceeded entirely along circumstantial lines. Investigators built a case around the following categories of evidence: Snyder's conduct on the morning of the killing, evidence suggesting that the person responsible had taken deliberate steps to delay the discovery of Frances, evidence establishing that the death was not consistent with robbery, a random assault, or any criminal actor other than someone who knew and targeted Frances specifically, and evidence of the state of the marriage and the alleged financial motive. Despite the investigation, no arrest was made in 1986. The case remained open. 7 years passed. During those years, the investigation continued at various levels of activity, and the evidence was reviewed and assessed periodically by the state's attorney's office. In 1993, 7 years after Frances K. Snyder's death, William Snyder was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His trial proceeded to a jury verdict in 1993. He was convicted. The proceedings were unusual in at least one respect. During the trial, Snyder chose to deliver part of his own closing argument to the jury, a legally permissible but practically uncommon choice. The Maryland Court of Special Appeals reversed the conviction in 1995. The appellate court found that the trial court had improperly admitted testimony from police investigators that the court characterized as speculative. opinion testimony that went beyond what the evidence supported and crossed into territory that could unfairly prejudice a jury. Snyder was retried. The second trial took place before a jury in 1997. The jury returned a guilty verdict. Snyder was again convicted of first-degree murder. He appealed again. This time the case reached the Maryland Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, equivalent to a Supreme Court, which issued its opinion in November of 2000. The Court of Appeals reversed the second conviction and ordered a new trial for the second time. The issue in the 2000 appeal was a specific type of evidence, testimony about Snyder's behavior during the investigation, specifically testimony about the fact that Snyder had not made inquiries about how the investigation was proceeding or what law enforcement had learned. The prosecution had offered this evidence as proof of what is called consciousness of guilt, the legal theory that a guilty person's behavior after a crime, including their failure to act the way an innocent person would be expected to act, can itself be evidence of guilt. The Court of Appeals analyzed that evidence carefully and held that it was not admissible in the context in which it had been used. The court found that using a defendant's silence or failure to inquire about an investigation as evidence of guilty knowledge raised serious problems under the rules of evidence, and that its admission in the Snyder case had been an error that required a new trial. The Snyder v. State opinion, reported at 361 Maryland 580, is one of the significant Maryland appellate decisions on consciousness of guilt evidence and on the limits of that doctrine. The Court of Appeals decision ordered a third trial. A transparency note is appropriate here, and it is delivered directly and without qualification. The final disposition of the William Snyder Sr. case following the 2000 new trial order could not be confirmed through the public records available during the production of this program. The documented record presented here is complete and accurate through the Court of Appeals November 2000 ruling. What happened at and after the third trial, if a third trial occurred, is not stated in this program because it could not be sourced to a verified public record. We present what we know and clearly flag what we do not know, because that is the standard truth 2Bear holds itself to. What is certain is this: the appellate history of the William Snyder Sr. case shaped Maryland evidence law in ways that practitioners, judges, and law students continue to study. The 2000 Court of Appeals opinion is a limit case. It defines a boundary on what kind of behavioral evidence a prosecutor can bring before a jury and call it proof of guilt. That contribution to the law exists regardless of what a third jury may ultimately have decided. Frances K. Snyder was 43 years old on Valentine's Day in 1986. She had 5 children. She was on her way to work when she was killed. That is in the public record. It does not change. We are past the halfway mark. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Truth 2Bear if you have not already. Case 6 takes us to Frederick County in a case built in part on cell phone location data. Case 6. He called 911 and told officers his wife had left their home because she needed air. He said he had taken their young son in the car to search for her. He said a family member advised him to call for help. That account, given on March the 22nd, 2020, began to fall apart within days. Not because of what witnesses said, but because of what a cell phone recorded. Thomas Anthony Lehan and Kathleen Lehan, known to family and friends as Katie, lived in Middletown, a small town in Frederick County in western Maryland. They had a young son together. Their residence was on the 200 block of Broad Street in Middletown, a quiet residential area in one of the smaller incorporated towns in that part of the state. On March the 22nd, 2020, Thomas Lehan contacted the Frederick County Sheriff's Office. He reported that his wife had left the home. He described her departure as a decision she had made because she needed air, suggesting an emotional or interpersonal exchange that had caused her to leave the house. He told investigators that he had driven around the area with their son. I looking for her before calling 911 on the advice of family. He did not know where she had gone. The Frederick County Sheriff's Office opened a missing person investigation. Deputies and detectives began the standard protocol for locating a missing adult. They spoke with family and friends. They checked her known associates and contacts. They canvassed the area around the Broad Street residence. From the outset, investigators noted inconsistencies in Thomas Leon's account. The specific details he provided about where he had driven and when he had been in certain locations did not align cleanly with what detectives were learning from other sources. Those other sources included cell phone location data, the records generated by a mobile phone as it connects to cell towers and transmits location information through the cellular network. Cell site location data is a significant investigative tool in the modern era. When a cell phone is in use, and depending on settings, even when it is not actively in use, it generates records of its proximity to specific cell towers. Those records are stored by the wireless carrier and can be obtained by law enforcement through a legal process, typically a court order or search warrant. When those records were obtained in the Lehan investigation and compared with the account Lehan had given investigators, they produced contradictions. The data placed him in locations or away from locations in ways that did not match his statements, and the investigation expanded. The Frederick County Sheriff's Office brought in additional investigative resources, including the Maryland State Police and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Police. Federal investigators also provided assistance. A multi-agency approach was applied to the search for Katie Lehan. One of the specialized resources deployed in the investigation was a cadaver dog, a dog trained specifically to detect the presence of human remains through scent, even in outdoor environments after a period of time has passed. The cadaver dog was deployed along a road called Reno Monument Road in the rural area outside Middletown. The dog alerted at specific locations along that road. At one alert location, the ground and surrounding vegetation showed signs consistent with an object or weight having rested there and having been dragged for a distance. Leaves had been disturbed and flattened. Those physical characteristics were documented and became part of the investigation record. Investigators executed a search and seizure warrant at the Lehan residence on Broad Street. The warrant allowed investigators to search the interior of the home and collect any evidence relevant to the investigation. On March the 26th, 2020, 4 days after the initial report, the investigation reached a pivotal moment. Thomas Leon contacted his father-in-law, Katie's father, and told him what had happened. Leon told his father-in-law that he was responsible for Katie's death. Later the same day, Leon spoke with investigators and provided them with information about the location of Katie Leon's remains. He stated that Katie had died inside the family home on March the 22nd. He told investigators that he had initially taken her body to a location along Lambs Knoll Road, also in the rural area outside Middletown. He stated that on March the 23rd, the day after her death, he had returned to that location and moved her remains again, this time to a creek bed in the area between the small Frederick County towns of Burkittsville and Brunswick. Investigators traveled to that location and the remains of Kathleen Katie Lehan were recovered from the creek bed. Thomas Anthony Lehan was charged with first-degree murder and with multiple counts of altering physical evidence, charges connected to his actions in moving the remains to 2 different locations over the course of 2 days. As the case moved toward legal resolution, Lehan entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. As part of the plea agreement, the state elected not to proceed on the 3 evidence alteration counts. The guilty plea was accepted by the court. The sentencing hearing took place on March the 11th, 2022, nearly 2 years after Katie Lehan's death. The case was prosecuted by Frederick County State's Attorney Charlie Smith, with Chief Assistant State's Attorney Rebecca Clinton also representing the state at sentencing. Presiding Judge Julia A. Martz Fisher sentenced Thomas Anthony Leon to life imprisonment, with all but 50 years of that sentence suspended. That structure means Leon is required to serve 50 years before any reduction in his sentence can be considered. The Leon case is instructive in the documentary of modern investigative practice for two reasons. First, it demonstrates how cell site location data has become a standard tool for investigators testing the accuracy of a suspect's account. The data does not lie. It records where a phone, and by inference the person carrying it, was located at specific times. When that data contradicts a statement, it creates a documented inconsistency that investigators can pursue. Second, the case shows the contribution of cadaver dogs in outdoor searches. The deployment of a trained scent dog along Reno Monument Road and the alerts that followed directed investigative attention to specific areas in a way that no witness or database search could have done. Those alerts were part of what built the documented record that surrounded Leon's eventual confession. Katie Leon was a resident of Middletown, Frederick County. She had a young son. She is survived by her family. Case 7. She changed her phone number multiple times in the month before she died. She obtained multiple protective orders. She took every step available to her through the legal system. James Walter Harley Jr. turned himself into state police the day after her death. He had left on foot. The couple's 8-year-old son had witnessed what happened and was found in the neighborhood. Tanya Harley was 34 years old. She lived in Lusby, a community in Calvert County, on Maryland's western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. James Walter Harley Jr. was her husband. By the time of her death in April of 2017, the two were estranged. They were no longer living together in the same residence. Tanya Harley was living in the Lusby home with their children. In the weeks and months preceding April the 28th, 2017, Tanya Harley went to court. She sought and obtained multiple protective orders, legal documents issued by a court directing a named individual to stay away from and have no contact with the person requesting protection. Each protective order was a documented legal action entered into the court record, creating a paper trail of escalating concern. She also, on multiple occasions during the same period, changed the telephone number associated with her mobile phone account. That action, repeated several times, reflects an effort to prevent the person she was trying to avoid from making contact with her. Those documented steps, multiple protective orders, multiple phone number changes, formed part of what investigators would later characterize as a pattern. The pattern documented that James Harley had been attempting to maintain contact with Tanya despite her legal efforts to prevent it. The frequency of the action she felt the need to take illustrated through the official record the persistence of that contact and the response she felt was necessary. On April the 28th, 2017, Tanya Harley was killed inside her residence in Lusby. The couple's 8-year-old son was in the home at the time. After the event, the child was found in the neighborhood by responders. He was unharmed physically. James Walter Harley Jr. was not in the home when law enforcement arrived. He had left on foot. The following day, April the 29th, 2017, Harley turned himself in. He presented himself voluntarily at the Maryland State Police Barracks in Leonardtown, the county seat of neighboring St. Mary's County. He was taken into custody. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Calvert County Sheriff's Office and the Maryland State Police. When investigators executed search warrants and reviewed the evidence recovered, they found physical items that contributed significantly to the prosecution's theory of premeditation. Among the materials recovered were printed copies of threatening messages, communications that Harley had sent or received and that had been printed out, suggesting they were being retained deliberately. Investigators also found that Harley had in his possession the birth certificates of the couple's children, along with family financial records and medical documents. The recovery of those specific items, documents a person might retain if they were planning to take responsibility for children or assert authority over family affairs, was interpreted by investigators as evidence of planning. The protective order history and the repeated phone number changes, combined with the physical evidence recovered, supported the prosecution's argument that the killing was not impulsive, but was instead the result of deliberate planning. That argument, premeditation, is the distinguishing element of first-degree murder under Maryland law. A killing can be second-degree murder if it is intentional but not premeditated. First-degree murder requires proof that the defendant thought about, planned, and then carried out the killing. The evidence of prior threatening messages, the retained documents, and the pattern of contact documented through the protective orders all pointed toward an act that was not spontaneous. James Walter Harley Jr. was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. In May of 2018, he pleaded guilty to that charge. He was sentenced to life in prison. The prosecution was handled by the Calvert County State's Attorney's Office under State's Attorney Robert Harvey. The case did not end at sentencing. Harley later sought a reduction of his sentence. That request was placed before Circuit Court Judge Mark S. Chandley. On January the 26th, 2024, Judge Chandley denied the motion. The judge's stated basis for the denial was his concern for the safety and well-being of the community. The denial was entered into the public record. As of the most recent available records, James Walter Harley Jr. is incarcerated at North Branch Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, serving a life sentence with no reduction having been granted. The Harley case is frequently referenced in discussions of Maryland domestic violence law and protective order enforcement, for the same reason the Tortle case is. It documents a situation in which the legal tools available to a victim, protective orders, a law enforcement contact, changed phone numbers, were not sufficient to prevent the outcome. It also demonstrates the role that documented prior behavior plays in establishing premeditation at trial. The printouts of threatening messages, the retained documents, and the pattern of contact built a record from which a jury or a court could conclude that the killing was planned. That documentation made the difference between first-degree and second-degree murder as a charge, and it made the guilty plea to first-degree murder the legally accurate resolution. 1980, 2015, 2017. 3 significant dates in a single case. A man convicted of his wife's murder in the summer of 1980. That conviction overturned 35 years later on a procedural error. A retrial in 2017, a second guilty verdict, a second life sentence, handed down 37 years after the first one. Charles Edward Sims Sr. is, as far as the public record of Maryland criminal cases indicates, a man who was convicted of killing his wife twice, with nearly 4 decades between the verdicts. Charles Edward Sims Sr. lived with his wife, Darlene Bell Moore Sims, in the Parsonsburg area of Wicomico County on Maryland's eastern shore. Parsonsburg is a small, unincorporated community in the central part of Wicomico County, east of Salisbury. By the time of Darlene Sims's death, the two were estranged. In March of 1980, Darlene Sims was shot and killed at the family residence in Parsonsburg. An investigation followed. Evidence was collected. The case was built around firearm and ballistic evidence along with other materials developed by investigators. In August of 1980, Charles Edward Sims Sr. was found guilty of the murder of his wife by a Wicomico County jury. He was convicted and sentenced. He entered the Maryland correctional system and served time on that sentence. What happened decades later is a function of the appellate review process that applies in Maryland to all criminal convictions. When a defendant is convicted and sentenced, they have the right to appeal that conviction. Appeals can be filed for a range of reasons, including claims that the evidence was legally insufficient, that evidence was wrongly admitted or excluded, or that the jury received an incorrect instruction on the law. In the Sims case, a legal review that took place many years after the original conviction identified what the Maryland Court of Special Appeals found to be an error in the jury instruction that had been given at the 1980 trial. A jury instruction is the statement a judge gives to the jury before deliberation, explaining what the law requires and how the jury should apply the law to the facts. If that instruction is legally incorrect, if it misstates an element of the crime or misguides the jury on what must be proven, it can be grounds for reversal even if the evidence against the defendant was substantial. In 2015, the Court of Special Appeals reversed the original 1980 murder conviction based on the erroneous jury instruction. The court's ruling did not address the question of whether Sims was factually guilty or innocent. It addressed only whether the original trial had been conducted correctly under the law. The answer was no. The conviction was vacated. A new trial was ordered. The case returned to Wicomico County Circuit Court for a retrial. In a retrial, the prosecution must present its case again from the beginning before a new jury that has had no exposure to the prior proceedings. The original evidence collected in 1980, now more than 3 decades old, had been preserved in the evidence inventory of the Wicomico County law enforcement and court system. That preserved evidence, including the ballistics materials, was available for use at the second trial. The second trial proceeded. On March the 29th, 2017, 37 years and several months after the original crime, a Wicomico County jury again returned a verdict of guilty on the first-degree murder charge. Charles Edward Sims Sr. had been convicted by a jury of his peers for the second time of killing his wife, Darlene Sims. The sentencing hearing took place on June the 1st, 2017. The judge sentenced Charles Edward Sims Sr. to life in prison, a life sentence on a conviction nearly 4 decades after the original killing. The Sims case raises and illustrates several significant aspects of the Maryland criminal justice system. The first is the endurance and accessibility of the appellate review process. Maryland's appellate system provides defendants with the ability to challenge a conviction long after it has been entered, provided the challenge is grounded in identifiable legal error. That process exists to protect the integrity of every verdict. When it finds an error, it orders a correction, in this case, a new trial. The second significant aspect is the ability of the prosecution to retry a case using evidence collected decades earlier. Physical evidence, when properly preserved, does not become legally unavailable simply because time has passed. Ballistics evidence collected in 1980 retained its evidentiary value in 2017 because it had been properly maintained. The third aspect is the outcome. The second jury, hearing the case with corrected legal instructions, reached the same factual conclusion the first jury had reached. Charles Edward Sims Sr. killed Darlene Bell Moore Sims. That conclusion, entered into the record twice, now stands as his permanent legal history. Darlene Sims was a resident of Parsonsburg, Wicomico County. She is survived in the public record by the verdicts rendered on her behalf, a verdict in 1980 and a verdict in 2017, both of which name the same person responsible for her death. 8 cases, 8 Maryland counties, 4 decades of investigation and legal proceedings. Every name, every date, every sentence in this channel came from a public court record, an appellate opinion, or an official statement of a Maryland prosecutor's office. Truth 2, Bear Crime Stories does not speculate. We report what the record shows. If this stories were valuable to you, if you learned something, if you appreciate this approach to true crime documentation, do three things right now. Tap the like button on this video. Leave a comment below telling us which of these 8 cases you found most significant and why. And if you have not yet subscribed to Truth 2 Bear Crime Stories, do it now. Tap that subscribe button and hit the bell so you are notified every time a new episode drops. We cover real cases from real court records in every episode. You have been watching Truth 2 Bear Crime Stories. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next investigation.